When I first saw that cedar shod cabin sitting there on the north edge of my ridge, I didn't oppose. T reached for my phone to call the sheriff, and I certainly didn't oppose. T goes stomping up to the front door with a shotgun. Instead, I just stood there in the tall grass, feeling the steam rise off my coffee, and I realized that my life was about to become a lot more complicated. My name is Elias Thorne, and I live out on a 300-acre slice of heaven in the Pacific Northwest. A place my grandfather bought with timber money back when a handshake meant something, but as I stared at those fresh-cut logs and that shiny tin roof glinting in the morning sun, I knew that the end quote, sharing and quote, culture of the new suburban development next door had finally jumped the fence. You see, for the last 5 years, I've been the end quote, grumpy old man end quote, to the Blackwood Heights Homeowners Association, a group of folks who moved out from the city to end quote, get back to nature end quote, but brought every bit of their entitlement and bureaucracy with them, led by a woman named Cynthia Vance who treats the entire valley like it's her own private dollhouse. I've dealt with their golden retrievers chasing my cattle and their teenagers drinking beer by my creek, and usually a firm word or a call to their parents clears it up, but a whole building? That's not a mistake. That's a declaration of war. I walked back to my porch, sat in my creaky Adirondack chair, and just thought for a long time, because land doesn't and oppose, T protect itself, and if you let a weed grow long enough, people start calling it a flower. I knew exactly where my lines were. I'd walked them with my dad when I was 10, and I'd had a professional surveyor out just 2 years ago when Blackwood Heights started clearing their lots. So there was no doubt in my mind that this, end quote, community meditation lodge, end quote, as I later found out they called it, was sitting 40 feet inside my property line. I decided right then that I was an end oppose. T going to be the one to yell. I was going to be the one to document, because in this day and age, a man's word is a ghost, but a high-definition video file is a god. The next morning, I didn't an oppose. T go back to the cabin. I went to a hardware store and bought the heaviest gauge steel T-post they had and a roll of high-tensile field wire, the kind that'll stop a bull if he's got enough momentum. I also stopped by the electronics shop and picked up 4 cellular link trail cameras, the kind hunters use, which send a notification to your phone the second something moves. I spent the afternoon setting them up, hidden deep in the hemlock and fir trees, aimed right at the end quote, choke point end quote, where the HOA path bled into my woods, and then I drove a single post into the middle of their little trail and wired a sign to it that said, end quote, private property, no trespassing, all structures must be removed within 30 days, end quote. It was loud, it was ugly. And it was the first move in a game I knew Cynthia couldn't and oppose. T resist playing. Sure enough, my phone buzzed at 6:45 p.m. while I was frying up some bacon, and when I swiped the screen, there she was, Cynthia Vance in her $300 yoga pants and a puffer vest, standing in front of my sign with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. She wasn't an oppose. T alone. She had 2 of her board members with her, a guy named Marcus who sells insurance, and a woman named Sarah, who always looks like she smelled something sour. I watched the video in real time as Cynthia pointed at my sign, her mouth moving fast, and then she did exactly what I hoped she'd do. She grabbed the sign, tried to rip it off the wire, and when it wooed in oppose, T-budge, she signaled to Marcus, who pulled a pair of garden shears out of his pocket and snipped the wire. They didn't in oppose. T just take the sign. They threw it into the brush like it was trash, and then they walked right past the post, heading toward the cabin as if the land under their feet belonged to the heavens. I didn't in oppose. T sleep much that night, not out of anger, but out of a strange kind of anticipation, like the feeling you get right before a big storm breaks the heat. The next morning, a white SUV with the Blackwood Heights logo on the door pulled up my long gravel driveway, and Cynthia hopped out before the dust had even settled, clutching a leather-bound clipboard like a shield. She didn't in oppose. T wait for me to come down. She just started talking as she hit the porch steps, her voice that high, artificial pitch that people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while being completely insane. End quote. Elias, honey, we need to talk about that little misunderstanding out in the woods, end quote, she said, flashing a smile that didn't in oppose. T go anywhere near her eyes, end quote. The board has been very concerned about the hostile signage you put up on the community and oppose as historic access trail, end quote. I just leaned against the door frame, crossing my arms, and let her talk, because the more people like Cynthia talk, the more rope they give you. I told her as calmly as I could that the his store trail, was actually a logging road my grandfather built in 1954 and that the cabin was currently trespassing on my deeded acreage. She laughed, a short, sharp sound like a bird strike, and told me that according to their maps, the ridge was shared common ground intended for the spiritual enrichment of the neighborhood. We've already invested $40,000 of HOA dues into that lodge, Elias, She said, her tone shifting from fake sweet to cold steel, And we are in oppos. T gonna let one bitter neighbor block the progress of this community. You should really think about the liability of interfering with HOA assets. I didn't in oppos. T argue, I didn't in oppos. T show her the photos. I just told her she had 29 days left and went back inside to finish my coffee while she stood on my porch, sputtering about, prescriptive easements, the spirit of the law, Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment started. Little things at first. Anonymous noise complaints about my tractor, a letter from the county saying my fence wasn't in oppos, up to aesthetic code, and more HOA members purposefully hiking onto my land just to wave at my cameras. I didn't in oppos. Budge. I just kept filing the clips, each one a time-stamped record of willful trespass after a verbal and written warning. I even went out and replaced the sign, this time using a massive wooden board bolted to 2 posts buried in concrete, and I added a second sign that listed the exact case number of the police report I'd filed for the first act of vandalism. The local sheriff, a guy named Miller who's known me since high school, came out to see the cabin, and even he couldn't in oppos. T believed the gall of it. Elias, he said, scratching his head, I can cite them for trespass, but until a judge tells him to move it, it's a civil mess. You sure you want to go through the ringer on this? I told him I was in oppos. T going through any ringer, I was just following the law of abandoned property. The 30th day arrived on a Tuesday, a cold, drizzly morning that felt like the end of something. I'd spent the last month doing my homework, reading the state statutes on unauthorized improvements and the rights of landowners to reclaim their soil. I'd also hired a local attorney, a shark named Ben who specializes in land disputes, and he confirmed that since the HOA had no deed, no easement, and had ignored a formal notice to vacate, anything left on that land after 30 days was legally mine to dispose of as I saw fit. I sat in my truck at the edge of the woods, watching the countdown on my watch, and at exactly 8:01 a.m., I picked up my radio and gave the signal. 2 minutes later, the roar of a D6 bulldozer filled the valley, a sound that usually means progress, but today it meant a very expensive lesson in boundaries. I'd hired a demolition crew from 2 towns over, guys who didn't in oppos. Tino, Cynthia, and didn't in oppos. T care about the Blackwood Heights vibe. They rolled up that old logging road with a bulldozer and a massive dump trailer. And they didn't in oppos. T hesitate for a second. I stood back and watched as the steel blade of the dozer caught the corner of that meditation lodge, and the sound of cedars snapping was like a gunshot in the quiet woods. It didn't in oppos. T take long, maybe 45 minutes, for the whole thing to be reduced to a pile of splinters and twisted tin. I had a drone in the air, capturing every second of it from above, cinematic wide shot of justice being served in real time. We didn't in oppos. T just leave the mess there, though, because I'm a man of my word. I had the crew load every single scrap, every nail, every piece of insulation into that trailer, and we drove it right around to the main entrance of Blackwood Heights. We dumped the entire load right in the middle of the HOA and oppos. That's manicured entrance, right under their gold leaf sign, and I taped a copy of the final invoice for the demolition to the pile. The total was $6,000, and I made sure to include the emergency disposal fee. By the time the dust settled, Cynthia was there, of course, along with half the neighborhood, and the scene was absolute chaos. People were screaming. Sarah was crying over a piece of broken cedar she'd helped stain, and Cynthia looked like she was about to have a literal stroke, her face a shade of purple I've only ever seen on a ripe plum. She kept screaming that she was going to have me arrested, that I was a criminal, that I'd stolen, community property, but but I just pointed at the pile and said, and quote, I believe you dropped something on my ridge. I'm just returning it to you. End quote. The lawsuit came fast, a massive, sprawling document that accused me of everything from, end quote, intentional infliction of emotional distress, end quote, to, end quote, malicious destruction of property, end quote, and, end quote, theft of communal assets, end quote. They were suing me for the cost of the cabin, the legal fees, and another $50,000 in, end quote, punitive damages, end quote, for the trauma I'd caused the neighborhood. For 6 months, the air in the valley was thick with tension. Neighbors I'd known for years wooed and oppos. T looked me in the eye at the grocery store, and I had to put a gate on my driveway just to keep the, end quote, protesters, end quote, away. But Ben, my lawyer, just kept telling me to stay quiet and let the evidence do the talking. End quote, they're building a house of cards, Elias, end quote. He'd say, end quote, and Cynthia is the wind that's going to blow it down, end quote. When we finally got to court, it was like a circus. The HOA had packed the benches with residents wearing, end quote, community strong, end quote, T-shirts, and Cynthia took the stand like she was a martyr for the cause of suburban peace. She testified for 2 hours about how they'd meticulously researched the land, how they'd tried to, end quote, partner, end quote, with me, and how I'd, end quote, viciously, end quote, attack their retreat without any warning. She actually looked the judge in the eye and said, under oath, that there were never any signs that I'd lured them into a trap by pretending to be okay with the construction, and that they had and, quote, verbal agreement, end quote, from my late father that the ridge was public land. It was a bold move, a desperate move, and it was the last move she ever made as president. Ben stood up, calm as a lake in summer, and he didn't end oppos. T asked her a single question at first. He just turned on the courtroom's projector. We played the 4K video of her and Marcus cutting the first sign. Then we played the video of her on my porch where I clearly told her the cabin was trespassing. And then, for the final blow, we played the drone footage of the demolition, synced up with the certified mail receipts showing that every member of the board had signed for the 30-day notice. But the Real, end quote, meltdown, end quote, the one people still talk about in this county, happened when the judge asked Cynthia to identify the map she'd used to justify the build. She pulled out a colorful, laminated, end quote, community master plan, end quote, that their architect had drawn up, and Ben calmly held up the official county plat map from the archives. The lines wherein and oppos. To even close. The HOA's map was a work of fiction, a literal drawing of where they wished the line was. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Henderson who grew up on a farm herself, didn't end oppos, to even wait for the closing arguments. She looked at Cynthia and told her that in 30 years on the bench, she'd never seen such a, end quote, fragrant and arrogant display of landlust, end quote. She dismissed the HOA's suit with prejudice, meaning they could never bring it up again, and then she turned the tables. She awarded me the full cost of my legal fees, the cost of the new fence I'd had to build, and then she did something beautiful. She referred the case to the district attorney for a formal investigation into perjury and a misappropriation of HOA funds. It turns out Cynthia had used community dues to build that cabin without a full board vote, thinking she could just, end quote, apologize later, end quote, once it was a landmark. Today, the ridge is quiet again. The hemlocks are growing over the spot where the cabin once stood, and the only sound you hear in the morning is the wind and the birds. Cynthia moved out 3 months after the trial. Her house went into foreclosure because the HOA sued her to get their $40,000 back, and the new board president is a retired school teacher who actually knows how to read a map. I still walk my lines every morning with my coffee, and I have a new sign out there, a small one, made of iron. It says, end quote, good fences make good neighbors, but good deeds make better ones, end quote. I don an oppos. T know if I'm the hero or the villain in the stories they tell over at Blackwood Heights. And honestly, I don an oppos. T care because at the end of the day, a man's home, ISN and oppos. T just his castle. It's his peace of mind. And that's something you can and oppos. T put a price on. But I've been thinking lately, did I go too far by dumping that trash at their entrance? Or was that the only language a person like Cynthia could understand? Sometimes you have to meet fire with a controlled burn to save the rest of the forest, but I want to know what you think. Was I a justified landowner defending his legacy, or was I just a bitter neighbor who chose the most destructive path possible? Have you ever had to draw a hard line with an HOA or a neighbor who thought your property was their playground? Drop a comment below and let's talk about it, because land is the one thing they aren't in oppos making any more of, and we've all got to decide how much we're willing to fight for. If you enjoyed this trip out to the Ridge, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the backwoods. And remember,